Hello and welcome to So Now What with Gates Cambridge, a podcast tackling some of the world's wicked problems with those who are dedicated to doing something about them. I'm Catherine Galloway, and my guests, as always, are Gates Cambridge scholars working to make an impact in the lives of others. This May, anyone who is anyone in artificial intelligence is keeping an eye on Seoul, South Korea. Exactly 6 months after leading tech powers came together at Bletchley Park in the UK for the first International AI Safety Summit, they are reconvening virtually for the AI Seoul Summit, swiftly followed by another in-person meeting in France this November. To adapt an old joke, you wait years for concerns about artificial intelligence to be taken seriously by global leaders, and then 3 summits come along at once. So, why the urgency? Bletchley was described as a generational moment by the organisers, who recognised the unprecedented and indeed unexpected speed of development of this technology and called for all hands on deck to ensure we end up with human-centric, trustworthy and responsible AI, rather than something considerably scarier. But is this still too little too late? Can ethics keep up with the pace of change in AI? For the first time in this series, I'm sitting down with 3 Cambridge-based scholars in the same time zone, around the same table in Bill Gates Senior House, the brand new HQ for Gates Cambridge staff and scholars, which opened its door earlier this month. So, a special in-person welcome to computer scientist Andreas Vlahos, who arrived here as a Gates Cambridge scholar in 2006, AI ethicist Kerry McInerney, Gates Cambridge class of 2017, and Richard Deal Martinez, who is currently in his 3rd year of a computer science PhD here as part of the Gates Cambridge cohort of 2021. Thank you all so much for joining.
Thanks for having us.
Now, Andreas, you are a professor of natural language processing and machine learning at Cambridge, and if you have a tech superpower, it would be in combating misinformation and bias. You were already working on automated fact-checking systems well before the era of fake news truly started making headlines worldwide, not just in the lab, but also with FactMata, the media monitoring startup you co-founded in 2017. You believe everyone everywhere has the right to be able to double-check the information they are given, and that AI can help us keep up with that tubs. Kerry, you're looking at AI with a mixture of skepticism and hope, if that sounds fair, pointing out the built-in blind spots, particularly around gender and race, but also asking us to imagine what better tech could be and do. The Good Robot project you started is now not only a wildly successful podcast, but also a book, both co-produced with your Cambridge colleague Eleanor Drage. You're a research fellow both at the Leverhulme Centre for the Future of Intelligence here at Cambridge and at the AI Now Institute at New York University, and aim to make complex questions on AI ethics relatable and actionable for the rest of us. And Richard, you've come to your PhD topic on how to make large language models smaller and smarter and potentially less biased via a concern about big data, big tech, and even big English dominating our current conception of what artificial intelligence is. You've seen Silicon Valley from the inside too, working for Amazon Alexa before taking your interest in how humans learn back to academia to ask, what if our machines could mirror that? Now, the 3 of you grew up in Greece, New Zealand, and Guatemala, Germany, and the US, respectively. Now, only 2 of those 5 countries were signatories of the Bletchley Declaration 6 months ago, and we'll get into issues of power and powerlessness, who or what is being overlooked in this headlong AI race and the effect of that in just a moment. But first, I'd love you to tell me the one thing that you're bringing to the table today that's going to help us get started. Andreas, let's go with you.
So what I'd like to bring to this table, and I'm very keen for the conversation we're going to have, is how to best talk about facts that we're all interested in and we'll debate often between ourselves, with our friends, family, with people on the web and social media.
So how we can talk about the facts and examine them as facts.
Yes, and because I think it's one of the ways that will help us reduce polarization, which is one of the big problems in modern society.
Okay, brilliant. What about you, Kerry? What are you bringing today?
I don't know if it's because it's so grey and rainy today in Cambridge, but I think what I'm bringing is actually a mood of contemplation. I think for the past 2 years, as an AI ethicist, it's been so busy, so frantic. We've had to grapple with so many ethical issues that have been thrust into the public eye very suddenly. And right now, I think what I'm interested in is stepping back and asking, what have we learned from these past 2 years when it comes not only to making technologies more just and more ethical, but also, to Andreas's point, how we communicate these ideas to broader publics and how we ensure that our conversations around AI are not just good and just, but are also participatory and inclusive.
That's fantastic. Well, let's try and mirror that today as we continue. Richard, what are you bringing?
Well, first, I'm bringing a sense of excitement at being in this brand new building here in Gates, Cambridge. As it pertains to our discussion, at a high level, I'm bringing a call, I think, for researchers to display a little bit more apprehension and modesty when it comes to releasing and constructing new neural networks. I think I want to talk about 2 things in particular that I'm interested in. The first is to think a little bit more critically about the behaviors of the models that we release as AI researchers. We are already aware of countless issues related to bias that are prevalent in the networks that exist nowadays. And I think it's important for researchers to communicate those issues with transparency and openness. And then the second thing I'd like to bring is for us to start talking about maybe environmental ethics as well, in addition to bias. So when we train neural networks, the amount of compute that is required is tremendous. And as a result of that, we release a lot of CO2. The emissions are really astounding. And when we're thinking about AI research, I think it's important to not just think about growing model size in order to push the boundaries of the performance of these models, but also to think about how we can do so more efficiently and whether we actually need bigger models in the first place. So that's the work in my research targets that.
Okay, fantastic. So there's a lot of issues already on the table. That's amazing. I'll tell you what I've brought, which is a quote that you will all know and roll your eyes about, but which was new to me. It's by Arthur C. Clarke, the British writer, who said, "Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic." And he wrote that book in 1962. It's called Profiles of the Future, an inquiry into the limits of the possible. And that was published during the first major wave of interest in artificial intelligence. But Andreas, I wanted to start with you by asking, isn't thinking of AI as magic or just maths in a box, which I've also seen it described as, a very convenient way of just letting ourselves off the hook ethically? You know, if it's magic or maths, we don't really have any agency over it.
Yes, I agree. It's not the maths that I implement in the code that the reason that my model has a bias, say, against certain demographic. Well, it was in the data, but it's what do I have to do with it? I didn't make the data. However, that's one way of putting what you just said, and I think it's like hiding our heads in the sand, because there's no such thing as an unbiased data set. Any data set is collected somehow, and for this to be practical, has to have some sort of bias. And we have, well, as soon as we accept that, then we actually will agree. I think that our algorithms, the maths that actually build the model from the data, are part of the problem, and they need to be part of the solution. Well, probably not the same algorithms, but some other ones with some improvements.
Can I add an example really quickly, just to say I completely agree with the point that Andreas is making? And in 2020, I spent 2 years with some colleagues at the politics department in Cambridge, interviewing engineers and data scientists at a big tech firm. And this was one of the exact problems that we encountered, which is that many of the engineers and data scientists were working with data sets that they saw as being inherently neutral, because they said they weren't about people, they weren't involving customer data, there were no identifiable individuals. And so bias wasn't really something they had to deal with in their work. But we would push a little bit closer sometimes, and we would say, okay, but where's your data set from? And they'd say, oh, it's from Wikipedia, for example. But if you look at Wikipedia itself, there's all sorts of ways that different kinds of injustice, discrimination, and bias are embedded into that platform. So think, for example, of how few pages on Wikipedia are about women or written by women. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the people handling those data sets are biased against women, or that they're deliberately trying to introduce some kind of anti-women or sexist bias, but the data that they're using is just simply not going to necessarily be representative of a lot of people.
That's really interesting. So we've gone from Andreas in the lab, knowing what the maths is doing. Kerry, you're out there pushing the tech firms to sort of maybe accept that the maths isn't completely transparent. And Richard, you were actually working in the den, the lion's den, as it were, at Amazon Alexa for about 18 months. Can I ask you, what did it feel like inside big tech at that moment? And what did they mean ethics to mean?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think I started researching AI or learning about AI during a really fortuitous time. I started my undergrad in 2014, and by the time I graduated in 2018, that's when we started seeing the rise of these things called transformer models, which have taken the world by storm. This is the technology that underpins, ChatGPT, GPT-4, Google Gemini. All these tools are based off of this model that came out in 2018. And I think it's really only been in the last 5 or 6 years, really, where there's been almost this frenzy to just try to train the biggest version of this type of model. When I was at Alexa, this was in 2020, I definitely felt that. There was definitely a pressure to just train bigger models. One of the issues is that we call ourselves computer scientists, but the scientific method is often lacking from how we do research. Oftentimes, it's just a matter of, well, why don't we just try something out and see what happens?
That's the move fast and break things, isn't it?
Exactly right. And so science, as it pertains to computer science, is more of a metaphor than truly being a science. And so at big companies, often what you'll see is people just trying to push the boundaries in order to push a certain benchmark up, right? And so when we were at Alexa, we had certain evaluation metrics that were defined to us by senior management. And our goal as research scientists was to try to generate models that could just make these numbers go up, basically.
And what were the numbers doing? What were you trying to make Alexa, who we've welcomed into our homes, and call her a her? Already we've just done it. What were you trying to make her do?
Well, in the context of speech recognition, there's this number called word error rate that everyone tries to improve on. So when you say something, how much of what you said does Alexa or any sort of speech model understand? And you can measure this through something known as the word error rate. So that's the standard one that everyone uses. And if you get that number to go up, that's basically seen as a good thing in the field.
So Alexa understands more quickly a more complex request. It becomes more personal to you. Is that the thing?
Word error rate isn't necessarily about personalization. It's just about when you say something into a device, how much of what you said can it actually transcribe as text correctly.
You were seeing the push to increase the numbers, but what was happening to people who were saying, hold on a minute, what does this mean?
Yeah, I think it's sometimes difficult in a big company to redefine the metrics that you're benchmarking your models against. These are things that were set many years ago by senior management, and in order for there to be continuity in the models that are released, you kind of have to stick with the same ones that were defined many years ago. And so, as an outsider, it can be easy to say, well, why don't we use this evaluation metric or that evaluation metric? But that sort of breaks the continuity or the ability to benchmark against older models. And so that's why I think coming up with new evaluation metrics, while that's a good research endeavor, it's very difficult to implement that in big companies.
You're nodding, Kerry. What do you want?
Yes, I think this is so fascinating to hear your experience inside the company. Because I also think it connects to your broader question around environmental ethics that you raised earlier, Richard, but also, Catherine, what you were saying about the problems of thinking about AI as a kind of magic. Because I think what that all pushes towards is this idea that AI is something immaterial. It's something like Amazon Alexa that appears as this disembodied voice in our homes. And that sometimes elides then the huge infrastructural, human, environmental costs of making these technologies. And I think the story that Richard is describing of this relentless push towards scale, this is something the AI Now Institute calls the pathologies of scale, is very, very common in a lot of different areas of AI development and deployment. And so again, I think the question that both Andreas and Richard are asking, which is what does it mean to step back, to contemplate, and to think about whether or not this is actually a good thing, is such a crucial aspect of making good AI. Certainly as an AI ethicist, often I get consulted very late in the development process. So people like me often get brought in at the end and asked to sort of troubleshoot maybe what's wrong with a model. And by that stage, honestly, it's too late. I think these ethical questions have to happen at the very ideation stage.
Andrea, you've had experience in that very hot startup tech space with Factmata. Why do you think you can make more impact on the direction of travel on AI within the academy here in computer science departments, rather than from inside the machine, as it were, in big tech?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think the answer depends on the person to a good extent and the personal circumstances. And to be honest with you, I could see that I could pursue my research objectives better by staying inside academia, maintaining independence from the metrics that Richard mentioned. If you're at a big company, the senior management will tell you which are the numbers you have to push for. So actually in academia, I mean, there are constraints here too, right? I don't think I have full freedom. That doesn't exist. Having said that though, in my case, I have enjoyed the freedom in academia by being able to pursue my research thanks to funding agencies that were kind to my ideas at the right point in time. At the time, it might not be obvious to everyone, but, back in, say, 10 years ago, when I had my first attempts at grant writing, which is how I get my academic freedom, really, was the dreaded Google question. That was, okay, you are asking for taxpayers, be it UK taxpayers, EU taxpayers, American taxpayers, for money to do your research. Why wouldn't it be better if you just went to Google or some other big industry lab, which already existed at the time, and did it there? And today it's again the dreaded OpenAI question. It's still relevant. And then, for me, the independence that actually I get, thanks to the taxpayers, really, to pursue my research, and that's something that I value a lot. And I had the good fortune in personal circumstances as well as career circumstances to be able to pursue it. And that's why I stayed in academia.
That's really interesting. So that you feel that you're closer to the people, you're more accountable to people, perhaps, in academia.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. Kerry, I'd like to bring you back in here because I was reading the amazing book Atlas of AI by Kate Crawford, which was published in 2021. And there was something she said in that book that really struck me. To understand what is at stake, we must focus less on ethics and more on power, meaning labor conditions, environmental conditions, and impacts, as you mentioned, Richard, justice of all kinds. So is that what you mean by good tech too? And how achievable is it, given what we've already laid out?
Yes. So another way that feminist scholars in this field have put it, I'm thinking of Ria Kaluri's work in particular, is actually asks, rather than saying, is this technology biased or not, saying, how is it shifting power? And why I like this framework of power is it encourages us not to look at these technologies in isolation. So saying, does this seem to be technically fair? But rather to put them in this wider context of what does a technology that allows people, for example, to surveil mean in a society where certain people are constantly being surveilled by others. And so if we take the example, say, of smart home technology, we were talking about Amazon Alexa earlier. Unfortunately, one of the horrible side effects of these technologies that wasn't really considered, I think, in much of the design and development process is that they're often now used by partners for intimate partner abuse. So, for example, to stalk or trap or surveil people in their homes, if we think of things like a smart lock or a Ring doorbell. And now there is a lot more awareness around this. There's a lot more guidelines in place for trying to ensure that technologies are designed in ways that do not facilitate coercive control. But I think what that shows is that it's really hard to design technologies that are safe for everyone without doing that big zoom out and asking, who is safe in the society that we live in? Like, who experiences forms of injustice or forms of violence regularly, and what can be done to ensure that our technologies don't just perpetuate this, but they can actively help combat it.
That's fascinating. And again, such a intimate, literally domestic, everyday example there of you fit a Ring doorbell, but suddenly that has a whole other meaning for everyday life if you're already in a vulnerable situation.
Yes, and the reason why I try to bring up this example, and I do it with a bit of a, anxiety or ambivalence about it, because I also recognize there are harms and dangers when it comes to talking about forms of abuse, because it can act as an idea starter for people. But the reason why I like to bring it up is because, one, I just think it's really important. I think it's a particular kind of privacy concern that people are still not very aware of. And secondly, just to kind of humbly reflect on my own experience, it wasn't one that I had ever thought of until it was brought up to me as a tech ethicist when I was doing in-depth research on this. And I'm someone who is relatively savvy when it comes to thinking about privacy and security and gender. But this was just certainly not a fear or a kind of practice I'd encountered before. And that's why I think it's really important to be having these kinds of conversations around technology and power and what that looks like for people in these very lived and intimate ways.
What I'd love to ask all of you is another thing that Kate Crawford brings up, which is she's asking us at this moment, as the technology is speeding away, literally faster really than we can think, and that's part of the problem, right? She's saying, why don't we overturn what she calls the dogma of inevitability? So think about a renewed politics of refusal and say, why use artificial intelligence at all? If this is really speeding away, why do it until we understand it better? Richard, what would you say to that?
Yeah, I think one of the tricky things with this type of technology is that things grow at an exponential scale. So if you wanted to, for instance, coming back to the topic of environmental costs, if you wanted to train a model that is twice the size, it wouldn't take twice as much money or twice as much time, right? It would take exponentially more time. And we find ourselves at this really scary part of the exponential curve right now, where models are growing at a scale at which we're looking at expanding the size of the models into the trillions of parameters at this point. So we have far surpassed even the number of neurons, for instance, in the human brain, all right? So these models are oftentimes 20 to 50 times already bigger than the human brain, something that they're trying to simulate, and they're only growing further and further right from here. So I would also say that I think that has the flip side also, that scaling something down by half can actually reduce costs by a factor of more than half. So for instance, with a model that currently exists, this is the Gopher model, they published a study where they showed that if they reduce the model by a factor of something like 5 or 6, they would only need about 2% of the computational costs, right?
So data power, size, environmental impact, drain.
Exactly. So thinking about scaling something down by even something like half or a third can have these outsized effects where now you're not looking at training, for 100,000 time steps, but maybe for 100 time steps or 1,000 time steps. The scale is the important thing here, the rate of this growth. And that's something that I think people have a hard time wrapping their heads around.
So that is good tech, if we can make it smaller and smarter for you.
Well, it's realizing that we lie on this continuum that is exponential rather than linear, right? And so if we can if something that feels like a small decision, like scaling down the size of our models by even half, that itself could have a massive effect. So things that seem like they have small differences might actually have big outcomes.
What do you think, Andreas? Can you see yourself walking back into the Department of Computer Science today and saying, you know what, why don't we just stop for a minute? Politics of refusal. How do you think that would go down?
Refusal to use artificial intelligence altogether.
Or, there is cause for moratoriums, pauses, guardrails, all the rest of it. Is it too late for that?
I must admit I'm among those that were skeptical about that proposed moratorium, because I felt that the main thing, it would just ensure that those that were already ahead of the game maintain the head start, which I thought, that what good is that for? My biggest fear is oligopoly of this technology. Monopoly is unlikely, even though we might end up even there, that would be even worse. But say a blanket statement that says we stop developing further this technology, I don't think it would have been beneficial at that point in time, at least, when necessarily we had a dominant model that just had come out, and it was ruling the arena, if you like, of AI. I thought it would have been counterproductive.
Okay, and has anything changed for you now?
Yes, to some extent. Now there are more models out there, more companies involved. A lot of them are startups, not just large tech industry. Now, so that being a startup is some kind of badge of honor or something. I'm not saying that's in itself a good thing, but the fact that there are more players, that's a good thing, because there's more competition for them to offer better models, cheaper models, more accessible models, more open models. And in fact, there's been efforts even at the state level or interstate level, like there was this language model called the Bloom, which was essentially funded by through cheap electricity from the French nuclear reactors. That's essentially entirely open, multilingual. It is an older, say, relatively speaking, it's like the level of what we would call GPT-3 in technical terms. However, it showed that it's possible. And essentially, we need this kind of thing to go ahead. The way to do this is like, if there's one company, for example, that has a very good model and everything else is much worse, there's very little incentive for them to become more open. If actually more of these companies and more institutions more broadly start developing them, they start competing against each other, and that will force them to improve their offering to the consumers, to their users, to the researchers. And that's why I would not support this kind of moratorium.
So what Andreas is saying is true. I mean, there's so many startups that are coming out with these models, but often it's hard to then pick, right, as a practitioner of AI, which model you want to use, because there just isn't really an easy way to compare these things apples to apples.
Kerry, you seem to be very keen that before we go further down this road, we need a lot more public awareness of what we're actually signing up for.
Yes, so I think where I really agree with Crawford is I think that refusal has to always still be on the table. Like I think, and this is coming from my background as a political scientist, I think that we don't want to foreclose other kinds of political options. That being said, where I agree with Andreas is that one of the things that concerns me the most is this hyper concentration of power in the hands of a very small number of firms who absolutely have first mover advantage and who, yes, I would agree in the case of the particular moratorium that we're discussing here, had the most to benefit from a 6-month pause on large AI models. But I think where I would like to see our energies go when we talk about things like pauses and moratoriums is less energy trying to encourage companies to not make things at all or to completely ban the use of certain tools, partly because I think that's not going to happen. And if there really was the political will to do that, then the people leading those companies could do that anyway. You know, I don't think necessarily it's going to be because, you know, 1 or 2 or 3 or a group of AI ethicists have said that they should do that. Of course, I'm not trying to at all undermine the importance of public mobilization. That's very important. But I think it's, you know, important to step back sometimes and say, you know, well, actually, if Sam Altman really thinks that we're going to see the end of the world because of the AI, you know, why is he, A, driving its creation, and B, lobbying behind the scenes of the EU AI Act for weaker regulation? You know, there's a fundamental tension there. So what I would like to see is less emphasis on this idea of pausing the models and more of a reorientation towards what does it mean to protect people's fundamental rights in an increasing digitalized, very hard word to say, in an increasing digitalized age. And I think this is something we saw, say, with GDPR, right, which was not a perfect piece of legislation by any means. I'm not a lawyer, but that is enough of a gist that I can get that. But really focus on protecting people's data rights. Now fast forward to the EU AI Act, which is an important piece of legislation, does grapple seriously with the many risks posed by AI, but at the same time has moved to being much more product-focused, much more risk-focused, and much less focused on people's own individual rights and capacities. And so I would like to see the public conversation around AI, pauses, moratoriums, refusal, refocusing back in on who's actually affected by these technologies as opposed to what these technologies are and can do.
I would like to add that part of making a law, GDPR or EU AI Act, is that it almost has to follow from educating the public. We actually, if we educate them, why maybe they shouldn't use this AI tool right now for what they're interested in doing, because that actually means that their data, perhaps about some medical condition they are interested in, might be sold to their insurance company, and then their premium might go up, which is actually a very real thing. So refusal is not something that we should just import and no, you shall not use this AI tool to improve your workday, to improve your assignment, your essay. You shall not use that because that's the law. That's unlikely to work. One of my favorite examples is smoking. People took a long time to actually get convinced that smoking indoors is a very bad thing, and it was impossible to enforce it. People did not want to respect that law. When they actually when the people were actually convinced that this was actually a good idea, the law was enforced, no problem.
But that's interesting because actually what we've been talking about is the pace of change throughout this episode. Things are speeding away. Everybody is now raising the alarm bell. We're in a really interesting point in this debate because we can pinpoint, almost as historians, the exact day that this almost started to really matter publicly, more widely. And that was Wednesday, November the 30th, 2022. That was the day that ChatGPT launched. And to quote John Norton, writing in The Observer recently, the world went apeshit. And so if we fast forward to this November, we're going to be at the AI Safety Summit in France. We're also going to be at the polls in the US. US presidential election widely predicted to be characterized by what they're calling industrial scale misinformation. So if we're up against speed and pace, so now what? What do we do right now, today, to do something about making our ethics embed much deeper into our AI? Help me out here.
I think this idea of having sort of like an FDA, the American equivalent of an FDA, which sort of oversees like the food and drug, markets in the United States. So in the U.S., the FDA is able to shut down companies that don't adhere to certain food standards, right? And it requires companies to do drug testing if they want to release a new drug on the market. For AI, even though in the U.S. we had, Biden's executive orders in October, I believe, where he, sought to introduce some legislation around the amount of reporting that companies have to do if their models exceed a certain number of computational steps that they've taken. It's a good idea, but it just doesn't carry any like regulatory or enforceable meat behind it, right? And so I think some kind of agency like that is going to be important, and some agency that forces companies to really be transparent and to adhere to a standard for how to communicate that transparency. So I think Margaret Mitchell, who's a good thinker or who's one of the preeminent thinkers in AI ethics, she's postulated this idea that companies should really introduce, with the release of their AI models, they should also produce a model card, which sort of documents some of the environmental concerns that I'm worried about, some of the biases that their models might contain, and also a dataset card. This dataset card would hopefully contain information about, what are some of the basic statistics of this card? What are some of the demographics of the data that are contained in this card, right? That could give way to different biases. So I think these sorts of ideas, I think, are very useful for us to be able to create something akin to like a nutrition label for AI models. And tools that help this goal, I think, are also going to be useful. So tools that help us maybe navigate through data sets to try to detect whether we can pinpoint areas of biases. That is also going to be very useful because currently these data sets are so big that it's even hard to navigate through them, right? It's hard to navigate through trillions of tokens of text. It's just physically impossible for humans to do that. And so we need to even build models that can actually scrape through the text. But then what are the models that scrape through the text to detect bias, right? And so it turtles all the way down. In order to be able to detect bias, you have to almost create a model that detects the bias. But then that model itself could have biases. So it's tricky. It's a very challenging question, but I think research into first these sort of like nutrition labels for AI models and then tools that help us investigate data sets and models. I think those two are good starting points.
Brilliant. Thank you, Richard. What about you, Andreas? So now what?
So now what? I'll start by saying that on the whole, I'm an optimist. I do believe that our race, human race, has been very good at dealing with misinformation for a long time. We've been facing information, misinformation, and we've been able to improve our life expectancies, healthcare, education. So I'm an optimist. And I think we'll still be able to do it. Now, of course, we have industrial scale misinformation, as you said. We also have, though, industrial scale access to information, to good information. And what we need, and we don't have at the moment, is industrial scale support for us to shift between the two. And that's what we need to develop. I don't want to create a sense of mistrust against everything we see on the web. That wouldn't be helpful. In fact, that's part of the problem at the moment, that people have lost their trust in the news sources they encounter, and then they choose to believe other things, which might be good. Some of these sources are good to trust in, others are not so good. So what I think we need support is actually, and what we need to develop is industrial level support for us to shift between information and disinformation and improve our trust and knowing whom we should trust.
I like the sound of that. Thank you, Andreas. And Kerry, give me a so now what?
Yes, so I think one of the kinds of support that we can provide from the AI ethics community to help this along is encouraging people and educating people when it comes to cutting through the hype around AI itself. Because I opened this conversation talking about contemplation, and I think looking back over the past 2 years from ChatGPT dropping is that there's been this extraordinary cloud of hype and drama and misinformation really around AI and its capabilities, what it can do, what it should do. And so a lot of the work that I now do with companies, with people like HR professionals, for example, is trying to cultivate a greater awareness of what these capabilities are, and most importantly, what the limitations are of the products that they're buying in, because they're often being sold AI-enabled products with far greater claims about what they can actually do than maybe what's even possible. And so I can't be a podcast host without doing a cheeky plug for my own podcast.
Go ahead.
Arnold Rage, The Good Robot. So for anyone who is interested in learning more about some of these wide ethical issues around AI and other digital technologies, you can find that on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. And we also have a variety of resources on our website, which is also called The Good Robot, so that you can delve into this in your own time, because I do not think that education or public literacy should ever be the primary or the only answer. I think that has to come from legislation, from meaningful political will. But I also think that, you know, as people who will all be and are all affected by developments in AI, you know, we have a right to know about these technologies, what they do and what they mean for us.
Thank you very much, Kerry. Well, I'll tell you what my so now what is. I'm going to cross the road from here at Bill Gates Senior House, and I'm going to go and visit the new sculpture at King's College that was unveiled this January, and it's called True for Alan Turing, and it's by Anthony Gormley, and I haven't seen it yet. And this conversation has really made me think that I want to go and see that in person and just have a little hard think. Huge thanks to my guests today, Kerry McInerney, Research Associate at the Leverhulme Centre for the Future of Intelligence at the University of Cambridge and host of the Good Robot podcast. Do check it out. Richard Deal Martinez, currently in the third year of his PhD in computer science as a Gates Cambridge scholar, and all speed to your typing fingers, Richard. And Andreas Vlachos, Professor of Natural Language Processing and Machine Learning at the Department of Computer Science and Technology at the University of Cambridge. He's also a Dinesh Damija Fellow at Fitzwilliam College. It's been sobering, alarming, and also inspiring to talk to you all. And my thanks also to producers Mandy Garner from Gates Cambridge and Nick Saffel from the Central Communications Office at the University of Cambridge. And of course, thanks to all of you for listening. We're brand new, so do let us know what you think. I'm Catherine Galloway, and this was So Now What with Gates Cambridge. Join us again next time for another wicked problem dissected by those determined to do something about it.